Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. The Ouija board gave us the name of a missing person. The police found their body yesterday. Part 1. A stupid game for fun. Alright, I'm not the kind of guy who typically writes stuff like this, but I've been thinking about it for days now, and I just can't keep it to myself anymore. I have to share this, or maybe I just need some confirmation that I'm not losing my mind. It's one of those situations where, the more you think about it, the more you feel like the world's gone off its axis. So yeah, here it goes. This all started about 2 weeks ago. My friend Tom had been talking about the deep web for months. He was obsessed with the weird, dark corners of the internet. Not in a sinister way, more like he was fascinated by the fact that it even existed. You know the type, right? The guy who watches way too many conspiracy theory videos and reads all the creepypasta stories about hackers and government cover-ups. That was Tom. Anyway, last Friday, he hit me up with an idea. He had found this forum where people would post about paranormal experiences, but not the cheesy ones you hear about on late-night radio shows. These stories were supposedly real encounters, and they were freaky. I'm talking Ouija boards, ghosts, urban legends, stuff that sounded way too real to just be fiction. Tom, being Tom, thought it would be fun to try something for ourselves. I wasn't really into it, but I'd been bored, and the idea of doing something spooky with the guys seemed harmless. So, that night, Tom, me, our friend Sarah, and her boyfriend Jason all met up at Tom's place. We brought a Ouija board. Now, before you say anything, yeah, I know Ouija boards are supposed to be a joke, just a piece of cardboard made by a toy company, but there's always that part of you that wonders if maybe, just maybe, there's something more to it. Tom had found a ritual on that forum, supposedly to contact the spirit of a missing person, or someone who had died under weird circumstances. It sounded like a load of crap, but we were feeling adventurous and a little reckless. We set up the board in Tom's living room, lights dimmed, candles flickering like we were trying to summon Satan himself. Honestly, it felt stupid. We were laughing at first, taking it lightly, moving the planchette around and trying to freak each other out. I think Jason was the one who started talking in a creepy voice, pretending he was possessed or something. Typical Jason, you know? But then, things got weird. It was subtle at first. The temperature in the room dropped. I know, that sounds cliché, but I swear to God it did. We all kind of stopped laughing at the same time, like we could feel something shift. Sarah was the first one to say it. Did it just get cold in here? That's when we stopped playing around and actually started the ritual Tom had found. The rules were simple. We had to ask for the name of someone who was lost. Someone who needed to be found. I'll admit, my heart was pounding a little by then. But we went with it. Tom asked the question, and we all put our fingers on the planchette. Who is lost? He asked. At first, nothing happened. We waited and waited, and just when I thought we were wasting our time, the planchette moved. Slowly at first, almost like someone was doing it on purpose. I shot Tom a look, but he seemed just as freaked out as the rest of us. It spelled out S-A-M. We stopped. No one knew anyone named Sam, at least not off the top of our heads, but then it kept going. H-A-R-P Sam Harper. We just sat there, staring at the board. No one said a word for a solid minute. I remember Tom looking up from the board, his face pale. Does anyone know a Sam Harper? None of us did. Sarah looked uncomfortable. Maybe we should stop, she suggested. I was on board with that, but Tom shook his head. No way, man. This is getting interesting. I regretted not stopping right there. Instead, Tom kept asking questions. What happened to you? He asked. The planchette moved again, this time faster, like it knew exactly what it wanted to say. D.E. A. D. I felt this sick feeling in my stomach. This wasn't funny anymore. We all pulled our hands away from the board at once, like we had touched something burning. But Tom, being the stubborn ass he is, kept his hands on the planchette, his eyes locked on it like he was in a trance. "What the hell, man?" Jason muttered, looking like he was about to bolt. Tom didn't answer, but the planchette kept moving. This time, it spelled out something that sent chills down my spine. B-U-R-I-E-D ... Buried alive, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. No one wanted to touch the board after that. We were all freaked out, and Tom finally snapped out of whatever had him zoned in. "Okay, that's enough," he said, looking a little shaken himself. We closed the board, blew out the candles, and agreed to never talk about it again. But here's the thing. As much as I wanted to brush it off as just a stupid prank, I couldn't shake the name, Sam Harper. It kept repeating in my head over and over. That night, I had trouble sleeping, and when I did, I had this dream. I saw a man, thin, dirty, his face pale like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. He was screaming, clawing at the ground like he was trying to get out of something. I woke up in a cold sweat, feeling like I was suffocating. The next day, I did something I shouldn't have. I Googled the name Sam Harper. Part 2. The name we shouldn't have Googled. So, I don't know if you've ever Googled something and immediately wished you hadn't, but that's exactly what happened the next morning. I couldn't get Sam Harper out of my head, like it was stuck in there, replaying over and over again. There was this part of me that didn't even believe the name was real, but at the same time, I couldn't shake that weird, heavy feeling from the night before. Anyway, I sat down at my computer and typed it into the search bar. Sam Harper missing. I almost expected nothing to come up, like I was being paranoid or stupid for even trying. But nope. There it was. Fourth result down. Local man, Sam Harper, reported missing, last seen 2 years ago. My stomach dropped when I clicked the link. It was an old article from some small-town news site. Sam Harper, 28, disappeared after a night out with friends and hadn't been seen since. No suspects, no leads. His family had filed a missing person report, but after a few months, it was as if everyone just gave up looking for him. The article even had a picture of him. Thin face, kind of scruffy beard, and tired eyes that looked way older than they should have for someone his age. That's when it hit me. He looked like the guy in my dream. The one I saw clawing at the ground, screaming. I mean, it wasn't an exact match, but the resemblance was close enough to make my skin crawl. I called Tom right away, my hands shaking as I waited for him to pick up. When he finally answered, he sounded half asleep. "Dude, it's like 9 a.m. What do you want?" "Sam Harper's real," I blurted out. "He's a real guy. He went missing 2 years ago." There was a long pause on the other end. Then Tom spoke, sounding a lot more awake. "What? Are you serious?" "Yeah, I'm serious. Look it up yourself. I'm sending you the link." I forwarded him the article, and a few minutes later, he called me back. This time, he wasn't so nonchalant. "Holy shit, man. This is messed up." We agreed to meet up later that day at the diner down the street to talk about it in person. I needed to know I wasn't the only one freaked out, and Tom, being the paranormal junkie he was, needed to figure out what the hell was going on. We didn't tell Sarah or Jason. They'd already been weirded out enough by what happened during the session, and there was no point in dragging them further into this unless we had to. When I got to the diner, Tom was already there, staring down at his phone like he was trying to make sense of something. He barely looked up as I slid into the booth across from him. "Okay," he said, without any small talk. I looked deeper into it. Sam Harper wasn't just some random guy. There are rumors, on some of the forums I follow, that he got involved with some really messed up stuff before he disappeared. People think he might have been into some deep web black market stuff. You know, like those creepy websites where they sell everything from drugs to... People. I felt my throat tighten. People? You mean like human trafficking? Tom nodded, eyes wide. Exactly. There were whispers about him poking around places he shouldn't have been. And then, poof, he vanished. I felt nauseous. This was getting way too real, way too fast. So, what are you saying? We summoned the ghost of some guy who got involved in human trafficking. That's insane. Tom shook his head, leaning in closer, lowering his voice. Not a ghost. I think it's something worse. Maybe we tapped into something dark, like whatever got him, whatever made him disappear. We sat in silence for a minute, both of us trying to process what he was saying. I could hear the clatter of dishes and low chatter from the other diners around us. But it all felt distant, like we were in our own little bubble of unease. I don't know, man, I said finally. I'm starting to think we should just drop this whole thing. Forget about it. But Tom wasn't having it. He was too deep into this now. We can't just forget about it. What if it's not done with us yet? We need to figure out what happened to him. Maybe we're supposed to. That last sentence sent a shiver down my spine. Supposed to? I didn't want to be supposed to do anything related to this. I just wanted to pretend it never happened. But Tom couldn't let it go. He suggested we take it a step further, dig deeper, maybe try to find someone who knew Sam Harper. I could see where this was going, and I didn't like it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hanging over us now, something we couldn't just ignore. The weirdest part, though, later that night, after I got home, I couldn't resist going back to that article one more time. I don't know why. I guess I just wanted to see if I had missed something. But when I clicked on it, the page was gone. A 404 error, like it had never existed. I tried searching again. Same thing. Nothing. No articles. No news clippings. No mentions of Sam Harper at all. It was as if the guy had never existed in the first place. That's when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. My stomach clenched as I opened it. All it said was, "Stop looking." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to believe it was a prank, Tom messing with me, trying to freak me out. But something told me it wasn't. I called Tom right away, but he didn't pick up. I texted him, "Hey man, stop messing with me." No response. By now, I was pacing around my living room, half ready to call the cops, and half ready to just throw my phone in the trash. That's when I got another message. This one had an attachment. It was a picture of a hole, a deep, freshly dug hole in the ground. And above it, in the dirt, I could barely make out the letters carved into the earth. Sam Harper. I dropped my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I thought I was going to throw up. There was no way Tom would go this far for a joke. No way. And if this wasn't a joke, I had no idea what was coming next. Part 3. The Disappearing Act. After I saw that photo, I just stood there, staring at my phone like it was about to explode. I don't know how long I stood there, but my brain was trying to make sense of everything. There was no way this was some sick prank. I mean, who would dig a hole with Sam Harper's name scrawled above it just to mess with me? And how did they even know I'd been looking into him? It didn't add up, and the longer I thought about it, the more I felt that cold, creeping fear that crawls up your spine when you know something's wrong, but you can't explain why. I tried calling Tom again. No answer. Okay, no big deal, I thought. He's probably busy. But then, I remembered. Tom always picks up. Always. He's glued to his phone 24/7, especially when we're in the middle of something weird like this. So I texted him, "Dude, you need to call me ASAP. This is getting way too real." 5 minutes went by. Nothing. I texted again. "Tom?" Still nothing. Now I don't know if you've ever felt that slow-burning panic, where you try to convince yourself everything's fine, but your body knows better. Your chest tightens, your breathing gets shallow, and your mind starts racing, filling in all the blanks with the worst-case scenarios. That was me, pacing around my apartment, staring at my phone like it would magically start ringing. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, my heart pounding. Tom only lived a few blocks away, and I figured I'd just go over there, knock on his door, and force him to explain what the hell was going on. As I walked, everything felt wrong. The streets were quieter than usual, like the whole world had gone on mute. Even the sound of my own footsteps felt distant, like I wasn't really there. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling this paranoia creeping in, like someone was watching me. I couldn't shake it. You know how when you're being watched, there's this sixth sense that kicks in. That was me, the whole way to Tom's. By the time I reached his apartment building, I was practically jogging. I rushed up the steps and pounded on his door. Nothing. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. "Tom?" I called out, my voice echoing down the empty hallway. Silence. I banged on the door one more time, but when I didn't get a response, I decided to try the knob. It was unlocked. That's when I knew something was really wrong. I hesitated for a second, my hand hovering over the knob. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me not to go in, but I ignored it. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Tom's place was empty. I don't mean he wasn't there. I mean the apartment looked like someone had cleaned the place out. All the furniture was gone. The TV, the couch, the random junk he always had lying around. Everything was just gone. Even the posters on his walls were missing, leaving nothing but faded squares where they used to be. I stood there in the doorway, trying to make sense of it. There was no way Tom had moved out. He never mentioned anything about leaving. And even if he had, why would he pack up in the middle of the night without telling me? I pulled out my phone and tried calling him again. This time, it went straight to voicemail. Now I was freaking out. I mean, really freaking out. I walked through the empty apartment, my footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. I opened the fridge, nothing. Checked the cabinets, empty. It was like Tom had never lived there in the first place. Then, I noticed something weird. On the kitchen counter there was a single scrap of paper. It looked like it had been ripped from a notebook, just lying there, out of place in the otherwise spotless kitchen. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and saw there were only 3 words scrawled in messy, hurried handwriting. "He's not done." I dropped the paper and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell did that mean? Who wasn't done? And where was Tom? I didn't stick around to find out. I practically sprinted out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. As I ran down the stairs, I called Jason. If anyone would know what was going on, it had to be him. Jason picked up after a couple of rings, sounding groggy. "Dude, it's early. What's going on?" I didn't waste any time. "Have you heard from Tom? Something's seriously wrong, man. His place is empty. He's gone. And I got this text last night." Jason cut me off. "Wait, what? What do you mean he's gone?" "I mean his apartment's empty. Like, cleaned out. It looks like no one's lived there in years." There was a long pause. "Okay, that's messed up. But, there's something else. I tried texting Sarah this morning. She's not responding either. We were supposed to meet up for coffee, but she's not picking up her phone. I thought she was just busy, but now..." My stomach dropped. "You're kidding, right?" Jason's voice was low, tense. "I wish I was. You think this has something to do with the Ouija board?" I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to admit that maybe, just maybe, we had messed with something we couldn't understand. But it was starting to feel like we had opened a door, and now something had come through. "Look," Jason said, sounding just as freaked out as I was. "I don't know what's going on, but we need to figure this out. Meet me at Sarah's place in an hour." I agreed, hung up, and headed back to my car. But as I walked down the street, that feeling came back, the one where I felt like I was being watched. I tried to shake it off, but then I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate footsteps, just a few paces behind. I didn't dare turn around. My heart was hammering in my chest as I picked up my pace. The footsteps matched mine, getting closer. I broke into a run. I sprinted the last block to my car, practically throwing myself inside and locking the doors. When I finally worked up the courage to glance in the rearview mirror, there was no one there. The street was empty, but that didn't make me feel any better. As I drove to Sarah's, I kept glancing over my shoulder, checking the mirrors, expecting to see something, someone, following me. But the roads were deserted. When I finally got to Sarah's place, Jason was already there, pacing in front of her door. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "She's not answering," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've knocked like 10 times. I don't think she's here." I stared at him, my mind racing. What do you think happened to them? To Tom? To Sarah? Jason shook his head, looking as lost as I felt. "I don't know, man. But whatever it is, it's not good." That's when we both noticed something strange. There, on Sarah's front door, scratched into the wood with what looked like jagged, uneven lines, were 2 words: "Stop looking." Part 4. The Vanishing Thread. Jason and I stood there in front of Sarah's door, staring at the words, "Stop looking," scratched into the wood like some kind of warning or threat. My mouth went dry and my heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. There was something disturbingly intentional about it, like whoever, or whatever was doing this, was playing with us. They knew we were going to come here, that we wouldn't stop digging, and this was their way of letting us know they were 1 step ahead. "We shouldn't be here," Jason muttered, his eyes darting around, checking the quiet street. "Something's watching us, man. I can feel it." I didn't say anything, but I knew exactly what he meant. That thick, choking sense of being watched had followed me all the way here, and standing in front of Sarah's door, it was like it was pressing down on me from all sides. But we couldn't just leave. Sarah was missing, Tom was missing, and this whole thing was spiraling into something neither of us understood. "We need to get inside," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I reached for the doorknob, half expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily. The door swung open with a low creak, and Jason and I exchanged a glance before stepping inside. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the half-closed blinds, casting thin stripes across the floor. The air was heavy, like the place hadn't been lived in for weeks, and everything felt off. It was like someone had pressed pause on Sarah's life. Dishes were still in the sink, her keys were on the counter, and her jacket was draped over the back of the couch, like she had just stepped out for a minute. But she was gone, completely gone. "Sarah," Jason called out softly, even though we both knew she wasn't there. Nothing, just that heavy, oppressive silence that made me feel like we were intruding. We started searching the apartment, even though I had no idea what we were looking for. Clues, maybe. Anything that would give us some hint of where she went, or what had happened to her. We checked the bedroom, the bathroom, every inch of the place, but everything was in its place. No signs of a struggle, no signs that she'd packed up and left. Then, Jason called out from the living room, his voice shaky. "Dude, come here." I walked back in and found him standing by the bookshelf, staring at something. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach turn. There, on the bookshelf, was a picture of all 4 of us. It was from a couple of months ago, just some random night when we'd all hung out at Tom's. We were laughing, drinks in hand, the picture so normal and happy it almost hurt to look at now. But someone had scratched out Tom and Sarah's faces. Deep, jagged lines, almost tearing through the paper. Jason and I were untouched, but Sarah and Tom's faces were just gone. "Who the hell would do that?" Jason whispered, his voice shaking. And why leave us? I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, trying to put the pieces together, but none of it made any sense. The Ouija board, Sam Harper, the missing articles, the cryptic texts. How did it all connect? What had we gotten ourselves into? I was about to suggest we get out of there when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost dropped it in my panic. When I pulled it out, I saw it was from another unknown number. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open the message. It was another picture. This time, it wasn't a hole or a name carved into the dirt. It was Tom. He was sitting in a dark room, tied to a chair. His head slumped forward like he was unconscious. There was something about the room that felt off. The walls were covered in plastic, and the light above him flickered weakly, casting shadows that twisted and moved like they were alive. But it wasn't just Tom in the picture. Behind him, almost hidden in the shadows, was a figure. I couldn't make out any details, just a silhouette. Tall, unnaturally thin, standing completely still, watching. Jesus, Jason breathed, looking over my shoulder. Is that Tom? Is he? I don't know, I whispered, my mouth dry. I don't know what this is. Before I could say anything else, another text came through. Come find him. My blood ran cold. This was a trap. It had to be. Whatever was behind this wanted us to keep digging, to keep looking. But for what? What was the end game here? Jason was pacing now, his hands on his head, like he was trying to keep himself from losing it. This is insane. This can't be real. Maybe it's some kind of sick prank or... Look at that picture, Jason, I snapped, holding up my phone. That's not a prank. Someone's got Tom, and if we don't figure this out, we might be next. He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. So what do we do? Call the cops? I thought about it for a second, but then I shook my head. And tell them what? That we played with a Ouija board, got a dead guy's name, and now our friends are missing. They'd think we're insane. And even if they believed us, we don't even know where Tom is. That picture could have been taken anywhere. Jason stared at me, his face pale, like he was trying to hold back the panic rising in his chest. I could see it in his eyes. He was scared, and so was I. But we were in too deep now. There was no turning back. Suddenly there was a loud bang from somewhere in the apartment. We both jumped, spinning toward the hallway. My heart was racing, and for a second, I thought maybe Sarah had come back. But then I remembered the scratched out faces on the photo, the words on the door. This wasn't Sarah. We moved toward the hallway, slow and cautious, every instinct screaming at us to get out. But we couldn't leave, not yet. At the end of the hall was Sarah's bedroom door. It was cracked open, but just barely, like someone had been inside and left in a hurry. Jason glanced at me, and I nodded. We had to check it out, even though every fibre of my being was telling me to turn around and run. Jason pushed the door open, and I felt my stomach twist when I saw what was inside. There, on the bed, was Sarah's phone. It was lying on top of her pillow, the screen lit up with one new message. Jason picked it up, his face pale as he read it out loud. You're next. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. We need to leave, Jason said, his voice barely a whisper. We need to get out of here right now. But before we could move, my phone buzzed again. Another text. It's too late. I felt my legs go weak as I read the words. I could feel something in the air, something thick and oppressive, pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. I looked at Jason, and he was staring back at me, wide-eyed, his face drained of all colour. We turned to leave, but as we stepped into the hallway, I heard something behind us, a soft scraping sound, like nails dragging across the floor. I glanced over my shoulder and saw something in the dark at the end of the hall. A figure, standing perfectly still, watching us. It wasn't human, It was tall, too tall, and impossibly thin, its arms hanging unnaturally long at its sides. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and hungry. "Run," Jason whispered, his voice shaking. And we did. Part 5. The Thing That Follows. Jason and I bolted down the hallway, not daring to look back. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst, and my mind was screaming, get out now." We stumbled out of Sarah's apartment, slamming the door behind us, as if that would somehow keep whatever that thing was from following us. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't stop. We ran to Jason's car, parked haphazardly down the block. Neither of us spoke as we jumped in, our hands trembling so badly that it took Jason 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. The car roared to life, and we peeled out of the parking lot, tires screeching as we tore down the empty street. For a moment, the only sound was our heavy breathing, the engine humming underneath it. We didn't say a word, too scared to process what we'd just seen. My phone buzzed again in my pocket, but I didn't want to look. I couldn't. I shoved it deep into my hoodie, as if that would keep the messages, whatever they were, from reaching me. Jason kept glancing at me, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "What the hell was that thing?" he whispered, almost like he was too scared to ask. I didn't have an answer. I had no clue what we'd seen back there, only that it was connected to everything. The Ouija board, Sam Harper, the disappearing articles, the warnings. It had been watching us the whole time, and now it had finally shown itself. "I don't know," I finally said, my voice shaky, "but I think it's what got Tom and Sarah." Jason didn't respond. He just kept driving, faster now, as if the speed would somehow put more distance between us and whatever was following us. But I could still feel it. That thing. The way it stared at us in the dark. The way the air had felt thick and suffocating in its presence. It wasn't just watching us. It was hunting us. After about 20 minutes of driving in silence, Jason pulled into an empty parking lot behind a 24-hour convenience store. He killed the engine and turned to me, his face pale and eyes wild. "What the hell do we do now? We can't just run forever." I knew he was right, but I had no idea what to say. I felt like we'd stumbled into something too big, too dark, and now we were in way over our heads. My phone buzzed again in my pocket, and this time I couldn't ignore it. I pulled it out, my heart racing as I looked at the screen. It was another picture. My blood went cold. It was Sarah. She was tied to a chair, just like Tom had been. Her head was slumped forward, her hair falling over her face. And behind her, just like in Tom's picture, was that thing. Tall, twisted, its shadowy form looming over her like it was waiting for something. But this time, there was something new in the picture. In the background, I could just make out the shape of a door. A plain wooden door with peeling paint. I zoomed in, my fingers trembling. There, on the door frame, was an address. Jason leaned over to look at the screen. "Is that—" "It's an address," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to go there." Jason stared at me like I was insane. "You can't be serious. That's where it is. That's where it's got them. If we go there—" "I know," I said, cutting him off. "But what choice do we have? Tom and Sarah are still alive. We have to try." Jason looked like he was about to argue, but then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This is crazy. We're gonna die, aren't we?" I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure if he was wrong. We pulled the address up on Jason's phone and started driving again, this time in a direction that made my stomach twist with dread. The whole way there, I could feel the weight of it, like that thing was already waiting for us, watching. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see it in the back seat, but there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching ahead of us, dark and endless. The address led us to the outskirts of town, to an abandoned-looking building surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted-out cars. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The kind of place you wouldn't go near unless you were desperate, or stupid. We parked a few yards away, neither of us making a move to get out of the car. The building loomed in front of us, dark and silent, like a tomb. "Are you sure about this?" Jason asked, gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were turning white. "No," I admitted, "but we're already here." We both stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at our skin. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around, to get back in the car and drive as far away as possible. But I couldn't. Not with Tom and Sarah still inside. We approached the building slowly, our footsteps crunching on the gravel. The door was exactly like the one in the picture, peeling paint, warped wood. My hand shook as I reached for the knob, but before I could touch it, the door swung open on its own. Jason swore under his breath, stepping back. "This is bad, man. Really bad." I swallowed hard and stepped inside. The inside was even worse than the outside. The walls were covered in plastic, just like in the picture, and the air smelled damp and rotten, like something had died here long ago. The flickering light from the photo was real. It hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. And there, in the middle of the room, were Tom and Sarah. They were tied to chairs, their heads slumped forward, just like in the pictures. But they weren't alone. That thing, it, stood behind them. Even in the dim light, I could make out its twisted, elongated shape. Its head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and I still couldn't see its face. Just shadows, shifting and pulsing like something was writhing beneath its skin. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. Jason froze beside me, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "What the hell is that?" I didn't have an answer. My entire body was shaking, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out. But I couldn't leave Tom and Sarah behind. "Tom!" I shouted, stepping forward. "Sarah!" They didn't respond. They didn't even move. Jason grabbed my arm. "Dude, we need to go, now." But before I could even think about running, the thing shifted. Its head tilted toward me, slowly, and in the faint flickering light, I finally saw its face. Or what was left of it. There were no eyes, no features, just smooth, pale skin, stretched tight over its skull, like a mannequin that had been warped and twisted into something monstrous. It took a step toward us, and I could feel the air grow heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. My legs wouldn't move. I couldn't run. I was frozen, staring at this thing that had no right to exist. Jason was pulling on my arm, trying to drag me toward the door, but I couldn't move. I was locked in place, my eyes fixed on that featureless face. Then, it spoke. Its voice wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A deep, vibrating sensation that seemed to crawl into my bones, wrapping around my thoughts and squeezing tight. "Stop looking." The words echoed in my mind, and I felt my vision blur, darkness creeping in at the edges. I thought I was going to pass out. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the thing stopped. It stared at us for a moment longer, its head tilting again, as if it was considering something. Then it turned and melted back into the shadows, disappearing into the dark corners of the room, leaving only the flickering light behind. Jason didn't wait. He grabbed me by the arm and dragged me out of the building, his breath ragged and panicked. We ran back to the car, not stopping until we were inside, doors locked, engine roaring to life. Neither of us said a word as we sped away from that place, the building disappearing into the rearview mirror, swallowed by the night. I don't know what happened to Tom and Sarah. I don't know if they're still alive, or if they ever were, but one thing's for sure. I'm done looking. I'm done digging. Whatever we found that night, whatever came through the Ouija board, it wasn't a ghost. It wasn't human, and it's still out there, watching. The Ouija board told us a name none of us knew, That person showed up at my job the next day. Part 1. The game that wasn't supposed to be. I wasn't even supposed to be there that night. I mean, I don't even believe in this paranormal stuff. Ouija boards, ghosts, demons, none of it. If it weren't for my roommate, Mason, I wouldn't have touched that thing with a 10-foot pole. But that's the thing with boredom on a Friday night, especially when your plans fall through. You end up doing stuff you never planned on, and sometimes you end up regretting it. It started like any other night. I was just chilling in my room, scrolling through Reddit, when Mason barged in with this ridiculous grin on his face. He was holding a dusty old box under his arm. Now Mason's the type of guy who loves a good prank, so naturally I rolled my eyes. "Dude, check this out," he said, practically shoving the box in my face. "I found this Ouija board at the thrift store for $5. You in?" At first, I laughed it off. I thought he was joking. Man, come on, that stuff's fake. It's just a bunch of bored kids pushing the planchette around, trying to scare each other. Mason grinned even wider. "Exactly. So, what are you afraid of?" That's how they get you, right? Call you out for being scared, and suddenly you're doing something you never wanted to do. I guess part of me just wanted to prove him wrong. Plus, Sarah and Josh, two of our friends, were coming over later, and I knew Mason would just get them in on it too. So, I caved. "Fine," I said, standing up from my desk. "But when nothing happens, you owe me a 6-pack. "Deal," Mason said, slapping the box down on our kitchen table like it was some prized treasure. When Sarah and Josh showed up, they were instantly on board, no pun intended. Sarah was all into the idea of trying to communicate with spirits, while Josh seemed to be in it for the laughs, just like me. We dimmed the lights, lit a couple of candles for ambience — I think Sarah was trying to be extra spooky — and set the Ouija board out on the table. I won't lie, the atmosphere did get a little creepy. There was something about the flickering candlelight and the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the background that made the room feel off, but I pushed it aside. This was just a game, right? Nothing more. We all put our fingers on the planchette, and Mason started doing his best scary movie voice. "Is anyone here with us tonight?" Nothing happened at first. I expected as much. We all exchanged smirks, but then the planchette started to move. Slowly, deliberately. My first thought was that Mason was pushing it to mess with us. I shot him a look, but his eyes were wide, almost serious. He wasn't laughing. "Who's doing that?" Sarah whispered, clearly freaked out. "I'm not," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. The planchette kept moving, gliding smoothly over the letters. It spelled out a name, A-L-A-N. "Who the hell is Alan?" Josh asked, his voice low, but still trying to sound casual. Is that supposed to mean something to anyone? None of us knew an Alan. Not in real life, at least. Mason looked around the table, waiting for someone to fess up, but all of us were dead silent. I could see Sarah's hands trembling on the planchette, but we all kept our fingers on it, as if none of us wanted to break whatever spell had been cast. Mason shrugged. "Maybe we just got a rando ghost. Let's ask something else. What do you guys want to know?" "Ask how they died," Sarah said quietly, almost like she regretted saying it the moment the words left her mouth. Mason complied. "How did you die, Alan?" The planchette didn't move for what felt like forever. I felt myself getting impatient, thinking that maybe we should just wrap this whole thing up and call it a night. But then, the planchette moved again, faster this time. C-A-R. "Car," Sarah whispered, like a car accident. Before anyone could respond, the planchette flew across the board, hitting the edge of the table and clattering onto the floor. None of us had let go of it. It just moved out from under our fingers, like it had been yanked. We all jumped back, startled. "All right, fun's over," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I bent down to pick up the planchette and tossed it back onto the board. "Whoever's screwing around with this, good one," You got us." But no one was laughing. Sarah looked pale. Mason was silent for once, and even Josh, who always had a sarcastic comment for everything, just stared at the board with his mouth slightly open. That's when Mason said, "All right, I think that's enough for tonight." I couldn't have agreed more. We cleaned up, boxed the board, and put it back in Mason's closet. Afterward, we sat around for a bit, watching YouTube videos and trying to shake off the weird vibe from earlier. By the time Sarah and Josh left, it was late. Mason crashed on the couch, and I went to my room, convinced it was all just a stupid joke that had gone a little too far. But here's the thing. The next day, I went to work, just like any other Saturday. I work at this coffee shop downtown, and I was on the morning shift. Everything was normal, until it wasn't. Around 10 a.m., this guy walks in. I wouldn't have thought twice about it. Just another customer, right? But then he ordered his coffee. And when I asked for his name to write on the cup, he said, clear as day, Alan. Now, I've been working at that coffee shop for over a year, and I've never met an Alan. I don't know anyone by that name. My stomach dropped when I realized that the guy standing in front of me looked like he hadn't slept in days. He had this blank stare, like he was somewhere else entirely. And then he smiled. It was the most unsettling smile I've ever seen in my life. Like he knew something I didn't. That was the moment I knew something was very, very wrong. Part 2. The smile that didn't reach his eyes. I don't usually overthink stuff at work. I mean, it's a coffee shop, right? It's not exactly the most exciting place in the world. But the moment this Alan guy smiled at me, something felt off. Like a weight had dropped into my stomach. You know how you can meet someone and instantly know there's something wrong with them? Not like in an obvious way, but just this subtle feeling, like they don't belong. That's exactly what it felt like standing in front of this guy. His smile, it didn't reach his eyes. They were just staring at me, hollow and lifeless, like he wasn't really there. And for some reason, I couldn't stop staring back. Alan, I mumbled, repeating the name as I scribbled it on the cup. My hands were shaking a little, and I hoped he didn't notice. But man, it felt like he knew, like he was watching every little move I made. He didn't even glance at the cup. He just kept looking at me, as if I was the one he'd come for. "Busy day?" he asked, his voice low and slow, like he was trying to make small talk, but didn't really care about the answer. I nodded, swallowing the dryness in my throat. "Yeah, pretty busy," I muttered, sliding his coffee across the counter as fast as I could. "Enjoy." Alan didn't move for a second, just stood there, still smiling. But then he reached out, grabbed the cup, and without breaking eye contact, he whispered, "See you soon." It was barely audible over the noise of the espresso machine behind me, but I heard it, and I swear I felt my blood run cold. See me soon? What the hell did that mean? I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a weird customer. I mean, we get all kinds of strange people at the shop. It's part of the job. But the rest of my shift felt wrong. Every time the door opened, I half expected to see that same guy walk back in. The whole place felt different, like there was this dark cloud hanging over everything. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even when the shop was empty. When my shift finally ended, I couldn't wait to get out of there. I grabbed my stuff, practically ran to my car, and drove home, with the radio blaring, just to drown out the weird thoughts swirling in my head. I mean, there was no way this Alan guy was connected to the Ouija board, right? That stuff isn't real. It couldn't be real. But still, I couldn't forget the name. The way it appeared on the board last night. The way none of us knew anyone by that name. And now this random guy shows up at my job, claiming to be Alan, smiling at me like he knows something I don't. My brain was in overdrive, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing added up. It was probably just a coincidence. A creepy coincidence, but still. That's what I kept telling myself anyway. When I got back to the apartment, Mason was sprawled out on the couch, binge-watching some random Netflix series. He barely looked up when I walked in, but I wasn't in the mood to talk about it. I didn't even know how to bring it up. Hey, remember that Ouija board last night? Well, guess what? Some dude named Alan just showed up at my work. Yeah, that would have gone over great. So I didn't say anything. I just grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat down next to Mason, trying to act normal. But normal wasn't going to last long. Around 8 p.m, Sarah and Josh came over again, probably expecting another chill hangout night. We sat around, played some video games, ate pizza. Everything felt fine for a while. The weirdness from earlier in the day started to fade, and I figured it was all just in my head. Then, out of nowhere, Sarah brought it up. "Have you guys thought any more about what happened with the Ouija board last night?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. Mason laughed. "What? The board moving on its own? Man, that was probably Josh messing with us." Josh shot him a look. "Dude, it wasn't me. I'm telling you, I wasn't doing anything." Sarah frowned. "But what about the name? Alan. None of us know an Alan. Don't you guys think that's weird?" I froze for a second. My brain started racing again, but I didn't want to look like a crazy person in front of them. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "It was probably just random. Could have been any name." That's when Sarah looked straight at me. "Maybe for you guys, but I had this really weird dream last night, after I got home." Now, Sarah's not the type to get spooked easily, so hearing her say this got my attention. "A dream?" I asked, trying not to sound too interested. She nodded, biting her lip like she wasn't sure if she wanted to continue. "Yeah. I don't remember all of it, but I was in this dark room. There was someone standing in the corner, and I think they were saying the name, Alan, over and over. But when I tried to get closer, they just disappeared." Josh leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "Man, that's messed up." Mason, still half laughing, said, "You guys are overthinking this. It's just a board game. Let it go." But I couldn't let it go. Not after what had happened that morning. And now Sarah's having weird dreams about the name too. I took a deep breath. So, I had something weird happen today too. They all looked at me, waiting. I told them about the guy who came into the coffee shop, how he said his name was Alan, how he smiled like he knew me, how he said, "See you soon." The second I said those words, the whole room went silent. Sarah looked freaked out. Josh stopped tapping his fingers on the table. Even Mason stopped grinning. "That's weird," Mason finally said, but he didn't sound so sure anymore. "Yeah," I replied, leaning forward. "I don't know, man. It feels like more than just a coincidence." For a while, nobody said anything. The room felt heavy, like the air itself had changed. Then Josh broke the silence. What if we tried the board again?" Sarah shook her head. "No way, absolutely not." But Mason grinned. "Come on, it's probably nothing. Besides, don't you want to know if it'll happen again?" I didn't want to know. I wanted to forget about all of it. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. Like we'd opened a door we weren't supposed to, and now we had to see it through. Against my better judgment, I nodded. "All right, but if anything weird happens, we stop. Agreed?" Everyone agreed, even Sarah, though she looked like she might bolt at any second. Mason went to grab the board from his closet, and within minutes it was back on the table, candles lit, fingers on the planchette. We all stared at the board, waiting. Mason, as usual, started things off. "Is anyone here with us tonight?" For a long moment, nothing happened. I felt a small flicker of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe we'd all just been overreacting. But then, the planchette started to move, and this time, it didn't spell out a name. It spelled out a message. I S-E-E-Y-O-U. The planchette stopped, dead in the center of the board. I ripped my hands away. My heart was pounding in my chest. I looked around the room, expecting someone to start laughing, to tell me it was all just a joke. But no one was laughing. Part 3. A presence. We couldn't ignore. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My hands were still trembling as I stared at the board. I see you. Those words were etched into my brain, burning through any shred of disbelief I had left. Whatever this was, it wasn't a joke. It wasn't a game anymore. The room felt too small, the air too thick, like we were all being watched by something we couldn't see. I was waiting for Mason to laugh it off like he always did, to brush it aside as a coincidence, or one of us messing around. But he didn't. None of us did. Sarah was the first to break the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. Who sees us? No one dared to touch the planchette again. We just sat there, frozen, waiting. It felt like the room itself was waiting with us, holding its breath. I half expected the candles to go out or something dramatic like in the movies, but it wasn't like that. Everything was too still, too quiet, and that's what made it worse. Josh finally shook his head and stood up, backing away from the table. Nah, I'm out. This is too much. He wasn't usually the type to get scared easily, so seeing him freak out like that hit harder than I expected. He looked genuinely shaken, more than he had been after any of Mason's pranks in the past. I wanted to leave too. I wanted to push that board off the table, grab my stuff, and forget this whole night ever happened. But something kept me rooted to my chair. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was fear, or maybe, deep down, I knew that leaving wouldn't change anything. Whatever we'd started wasn't going to stop just because we walked away. Mason glanced around at all of us, clearly trying to keep his cool. All right, let's chill. Maybe we should take a break. A break? Sarah snapped, her eyes wide. From what? Inviting something into our apartment that literally just said it sees us. She was right. We were playing with fire, and everyone knew it. Even Mason was starting to look uneasy, his usual grin gone. He kept glancing at the board like it might move on its own at any second. And honestly, I wouldn't have been surprised if it did. After a few minutes of awkward silence, we decided to call it. Mason put the board back in his closet. Shoving it behind some old clothes like that would somehow make it less creepy. Sarah and Josh left not long after, and I didn't blame them. I could tell Sarah wasn't going to sleep anytime soon, and Josh looked like he was trying to put the whole thing out of his mind, even though I knew it was eating at him. That left Mason and me. We didn't talk about what happened. Not directly, anyway. I think neither of us wanted to admit how much it had gotten under our skin. Instead, we just crashed in front of the TV and mindlessly watched some random show until the early hours of the morning, pretending like everything was fine. But nothing was fine. I could feel it, deep down. Something had changed. I tried to sleep after that, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that name again. Alan. And worse, I saw that blank stare, that unsettling smile from the coffee shop, playing over and over in my mind like a broken record. It was like his face was burned into my memory. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, the darkness in my room pressing in on me. Every shadow felt too thick, too real. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Eventually, exhaustion must have taken over, because I did fall asleep at some point. But the peace didn't last long. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, jolted out of a dream I couldn't quite remember. My room was pitch black, and for a second, I couldn't figure out what had woken me up. I lay there, listening to the faint sounds of the apartment, the hum of the fridge, the occasional creak of the building settling. But then I heard it, a soft thud from outside my door. I held my breath, straining to hear. There it was again, another thud, like someone lightly knocking on the floor, or pacing, slowly, deliberately. I glanced at the clock. 3:12 a.m. My first thought was that Mason had gotten up for a drink or something, but the footsteps, they sounded wrong. Too slow, too methodical, like someone was walking down the hall with a purpose, and they were getting closer. I stayed frozen in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to call out, to ask if it was Mason, but something stopped me. Something told me to stay quiet, to wait. The footsteps reached my door and stopped. I stared at the shadow under the door, waiting to see it shift, waiting for someone to knock, to open the door, anything. But nothing happened. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the door, every nerve in my body on edge. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Then, as suddenly as they'd come, the footsteps started again, slowly retreating down the hall. I didn't dare move until I was sure they were gone. The next morning, I was running on no sleep and a pounding headache. I found Mason in the kitchen, pouring himself a bowl of cereal like it was any other morning. I wanted to ask him if he'd heard anything weird last night, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. Maybe it was him, and I was just freaking myself out for no reason. But when I finally asked him, all casual-like, if he'd been up last night, his answer made my stomach drop. "Nope," he said with a shrug. "Slept like a baby. Why?" I didn't say anything. I just nodded and grabbed my own cereal, trying to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. Maybe I'd imagined it. I hadn't slept well. Maybe I'd just been half asleep and dreamed the whole thing. But it felt real. Too real. Things didn't get better from there. Over the next few days, weird stuff started happening around the apartment. Little things, at first. Lights flickering. Doors creaking open on their own. Mason joked that the building was just old, that it was probably the wiring or the wind. I tried to believe him, but there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that we'd unleashed something we couldn't control. Then one night, I came home from work and found Mason standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the Ouija board. The box was open, the board laid out on the coffee table like we hadn't packed it away days ago. "Mason, what the hell?" I snapped, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to. He didn't look at me right away, just kept staring at the board, his eyes wide, unblinking. When he finally turned to face me, his expression was blank, almost vacant. "I didn't open it," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "I came in here, and it was already out." I felt my stomach twist into knots. There was no way. We'd put the board away. No one had touched it since that night. Before I could say anything, Mason looked back down at the board, and that's when I saw it. The planchette was moving, all by itself. Slowly, it glided across the letters, spelling out something new, something that made my blood run cold. HELLO. The board greeted us like an old friend, and somehow I knew it wasn't done with us yet. Part 4. A door we couldn't close. The second I saw that planchette move on its own, my knees nearly gave out. There was no way to explain what I was seeing, no logic, no prank, nothing that could make sense of it. My brain was screaming at me to grab Mason and get the hell out of there, but my body, frozen. I couldn't look away from the board. Mason, though, was worse. He stood there, eyes locked on the planchette, like he was in a trance. I called his name once, twice, but he didn't even blink. It was like he wasn't there anymore, like something had taken him and left this empty shell standing in the living room. The board wasn't done either. After it spelled out, "Hello," the planchette kept moving, slowly, deliberately, like it had all the time in the world. The scraping sound of it gliding over the board echoed in the apartment, filling the silence with something that felt too heavy, too real. It spelled out another word, ALAN. That name again, the name we had no reason to know. The name none of us had spoken before the board revealed it. And now it was back, just like that unsettling smile from the guy at the coffee shop. "Mason!" I finally yelled, louder this time, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him hard enough to break whatever weird spell he was under. He blinked, snapping out of it like he'd just woken up. His eyes darted from the board to me, and I could see the panic setting in. "Dude! What the hell is going on?" His voice was shaky, and for once, he didn't have that cocky grin. He looked terrified. "I don't know," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. "But we need to get rid of that thing. Like, now." Mason didn't argue. He reached for the board, but as soon as his fingers touched the planchette, the candles in the room flickered. It was subtle at first, just a little sputter, but then they started to dim, like something was draining the light from the room. I felt the temperature drop too, like we'd suddenly been plunged into the dead of winter. Mason yanked his hand back like he'd been burned. "No, no, no," he muttered, backing away from the board. "This is bad. This is really bad." We both stood there, staring at it, neither of us willing to get close again. And that's when I heard it, faint at first, but growing louder, coming from somewhere down the hall. A whisper. It wasn't coming from the board. It was coming from my room. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It had to be in my head, right? But when I glanced at Mason, his face had gone pale. He heard it too. We didn't say anything to each other, just exchanged this look that said everything. Neither of us wanted to check it out, but we knew we didn't have a choice. I led the way down the hall, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The whispering grew louder with each step, but it wasn't like a person whispering. It was this low, raspy sound, like the air itself was speaking. My hand shook as I reached for the door to my room, and for a split second, I hesitated. But then, without thinking, I threw the door open. Nothing. Just my room, dark and quiet, exactly how I'd left it. But the whispering didn't stop. It was louder now, echoing in the small space, bouncing off the walls. And then I realized where it was coming from. My closet. I turned to Mason, my eyes wide. He looked as freaked out as I felt, but neither of us said anything. We didn't have to. We both knew what we had to do. I crossed the room, my hands shaking as I reached for the closet door. The whispering was right behind it now, like someone was standing just on the other side, waiting. I don't know what I was expecting to find. Maybe some weird trick or an old recording we'd forgotten about, but whatever it was, it didn't matter. I had to know. I yanked the door open, empty, completely, utterly empty. But the whispering, it didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, like it was surrounding us, pressing in from all sides. My closet was empty, but it felt wrong, like the air was thicker in there, heavier. And then, before I could say anything, Mason grabbed my arm and yanked me backward, slamming the closet door shut. "Dude, we need to leave," he said, his voice shaky. "I don't care what's going on, but this place, something's wrong with it." I didn't argue. I grabbed my jacket and phone, not even bothering to grab anything else. Mason was right. Whatever was happening in the apartment was beyond us. We needed to get out. Fast. We were halfway to the door when something stopped us dead in our tracks. A knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate knock on the front door. 3 times, spaced perfectly apart. Knock, knock, knock. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. Mason stood behind me, silent. Neither of us moved. Who the hell knocks on someone's door at midnight? For a long moment, we stood there, listening, waiting. Another knock. This time louder, more forceful. I exchanged a glance with Mason. He shook his head, mouthing the word, "Don't." I wasn't about to argue with him. Every instinct I had was screaming not to open that door. But we couldn't just stand there, waiting for whoever, or whatever, was on the other side to force its way in. Then, from behind us, the Ouija board in Mason's closet let out a loud thunk as the box fell off the shelf. It was like the board itself was pushing us to answer. Another knock. This time, it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from inside the apartment. I whipped around, my heart practically stopping in my chest. Mason was looking at me, eyes wide with pure terror. The knock came again, louder now, echoing through the living room. Knock, knock, knock. I followed the sound, my pulse racing. It wasn't coming from the front door anymore. It was coming from the wall. The far side of the living room, where there was nothing but a blank stretch of wall. I couldn't explain it, but there it was. Another knock. And then another, each one more insistent than the last. I felt Mason's hand on my shoulder, yanking me back toward the front door. Dude, we need to get out of here, now. We ran. We didn't even lock the door behind us, just bolted out of the apartment like our lives depended on it. My legs were shaking so bad, I almost tripped down the stairs. By the time we made it outside, my breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. We stood there in the parking lot, staring up at our darkened windows, not saying a word. The knocking had stopped. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating, like whatever was in that apartment had followed us out, watching from the shadows. "What the hell are we supposed to do now?" Mason asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't know. I didn't have any answers. But I knew one thing for sure. We'd let something in, and we had no idea how to make it leave. Just then, Mason's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his face going pale as he read the screen. "It's from an unknown number," he said, his voice shaking. "Dude, look at this." He turned the screen toward me, and my stomach dropped. The message was simple, just 2 words. "I'm here." And beneath it, a single letter, A. Alan. He'd found us, and something told me he wasn't going to leave until he got what he wanted. Part 5. A name we can't escape. Standing there in the cold, dark parking lot, I stared at Mason's phone, my pulse pounding in my ears. "I'm here." Those 2 words felt like a threat, a promise, and a curse all wrapped up into one. And that single letter, A, might as well have been a death sentence. Alan wasn't just some random name the Ouija board spat out. He was real, and he was playing with us. Mason was pale, visibly shaking as he stared down at his phone. Neither of us knew what to do next. Run? Call someone? But who do you call when some thing is haunting you? The cops? I could already imagine that conversation. "Yeah, hi officer. There's this guy named Alan who's stalking us. Oh, and he might be a ghost or a demon or something. Can you help?" I pushed the thought out of my mind. This was on us. We started it, and now we had to figure out how to end it. "Maybe if we just leave," Mason muttered, more to himself than to me. "Like, get out of town or something." "Do you really think that's going to work?" I asked, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. "We tried to leave the apartment, and he still found us. He's not tied to the place, man. He's tied to us." Mason didn't answer, just stared down at his phone, the glow from the screen casting eerie shadows on his face. I could tell he was trying to think of something, anything that would get us out of this mess. But the truth was, we didn't know what we were dealing with. We were way out of our depth. I don't know how long we stood there, silent and tense, when the parking lot light above us flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Mason's phone buzzed again. He glanced down, and when he looked back up, his face was a mask of pure horror. "Another text," he whispered, barely able to get the words out. I grabbed the phone from his hand and read the message. It's too late. Just 3 words, but they might as well have been a death sentence. My stomach twisted into knots. I shoved the phone back into Mason's hands. "We need help," I muttered, my voice frantic. "Someone who knows how to deal with this stuff." "But who?" Mason asked, his eyes darting around like he expected Alan to appear out of the shadows any second. "We don't know anyone who—" "I do," I interrupted, my mind racing. "There's this guy, Josh's cousin. He's into all that paranormal stuff. I never believed any of it, but if anyone can help us, it's him." Mason looked skeptical, but at this point, we didn't have any better options. You think he'll even know what to do? I don't know, but it's worth a shot. We didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my phone and called Josh. It rang a few times before he picked up, sounding groggy and annoyed. Dude, it's like midnight. What do you want? Josh, listen, I said quickly. We're in trouble. We need to talk to your cousin, the one who's into paranormal stuff. Can you get us his number? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Wait, what? What the hell's going on? I didn't have time to explain everything. I'll fill you in later. Just please, can you get us his number? Josh must have heard the desperation in my voice because he didn't ask any more questions. Yeah, give me a sec. After what felt like an eternity, he texted me the number and I called it immediately. It rang twice before a low, raspy voice answered. Who's this? I quickly explained everything. The Ouija board, the name Alan, the texts. I left out no detail, hoping that something I said would make sense to him. When I finished, there was silence on the other end. Then, finally, he spoke. You've made contact with something dangerous, he said bluntly, and you've let it attach itself to you. His words hit like a punch to the gut. I'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed out loud made it feel so much more real. What do we do? I asked, barely able to keep my voice steady. Destroy the board, he said immediately. Burn it, and don't look back. I glanced at Mason, who was still watching me with wide, terrified eyes. That's it? I asked, hoping it would be that simple. We just burn it, and it's over? No, the guy said flatly. It won't be over, but it'll sever the connection. Right now, that thing has a direct line to you because of the board. Break the link, and you might have a shot at escaping it. But you need to act fast. The longer you wait, the stronger it gets. I nodded, not even sure if he could hear me. Okay, we'll burn it. And whatever happens, he added, his voice lowering even further. Don't answer the door. Don't open it for anyone. Got it? Chills ran down my spine as I hung up. I turned to Mason, who had clearly overheard the conversation. We're burning the board, I said. Now. Neither of us hesitated. We raced back into the apartment, Mason heading straight for the closet while I fumbled around in the kitchen, grabbing the lighter and some matches. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Mason pulled the board out of the closet, but when he turned to face me, his expression stopped me cold. The planchette was already on the board again, sitting perfectly in the middle. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the new message spelled out, clear as day. D-O-N-T. I shook my head, forcing down the rising panic. We don't have a choice, I said, my voice trembling. We have to. Together, we carried the board outside to the small alley behind the building. The air was cold, biting against my skin, but it felt better than the suffocating presence of that thing in our apartment. We set the board down on the ground, and I flicked the lighter, watching the small flame dance in the dark. For a moment, I hesitated, wondering if this was really going to work, or if we were just about to make things worse. But we had no other choice. I lit the corner of the board, and we both watched as the flames spread, curling the edges of the wood, blackening the letters. The fire seemed to take on a life of its own, burning faster than I expected, like the board wanted to be destroyed. Just as the fire consumed the last of it, Mason's phone buzzed again. He didn't even look at it. He knew. It's too late, isn't it? Mason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to believe that burning the board wasn't enough, but I could feel it. That presence. It hadn't left. If anything, it felt stronger, like it was surrounding us, watching us from the shadows just out of sight. I grabbed Mason's arm, pulling him toward the apartment. Let's go. We need to get inside. We rushed back in, slamming the door behind us and locking it, but deep down, I knew that wouldn't keep it out. Whatever this thing was, it didn't need doors or walls to get to us. As we stood there, Breathless, the apartment went silent. Too silent. And then, 3 knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Not at the door, not on the walls, from inside the apartment. Mason's face drained of all colour. What do we do now? I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could say a word, the lights flickered and my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, dread pooling in my stomach as I saw the message. I'm still here. The Ouija board told us not to answer the door after midnight. Someone knocked at 12:01. Part 1. We were just bored kids, right? Alright, so I wasn't going to write this, but I feel like I need to. I need to know if this kind of thing has happened to anyone else. If you've ever messed with something you shouldn't have, you'll know the feeling. The feeling that something is watching, following, or worse. Maybe it's paranoia, but I don't think so. Let me back up. This happened about a year ago. I was 19, and my best friends, Mark and Sarah, were both around the same age. We were the kind of group that would hang out at someone's place all night, playing video games, watching trashy horror movies, and just being idiots. One night we were bored, like bored. We'd already cycled through Netflix, raided Mark's parents' liquor cabinet, responsibly of course, and still felt like we needed something else. You know that feeling when the night gets stale and you start thinking, what else is there to do? That's when Sarah, the queen of bad ideas, pulled out the Ouija board. Yeah, classic, right? I know what you're thinking. Ouija boards are a joke. And trust me, I was right there with you. It's like every dumb horror movie starts with people doing something stupid like this. But we were bored. And Sarah was always into the creepy stuff. Plus, I'd used one before and nothing had ever happened, so I didn't think much of it. We dimmed the lights, set the board in the middle of Mark's living room, and grabbed some candles from the kitchen. The whole atmosphere was a perfect cliché. Dark room, flickering lights, a couple of tipsy friends ready to scare themselves for fun. I think we were even laughing about it at first. You know, making fun of how ridiculous we looked. But then we started asking questions. At first, it was the usual. Is anyone here? What's your name? All that standard stuff. For a while, nothing happened. The planchette didn't move. The air didn't suddenly feel heavy. And we all just felt kind of dumb sitting there. Until it did move. It was subtle at first, like a twitch, barely noticeable. We all looked at each other. And Sarah, of course, was grinning like she'd won some kind of creepy lottery. She swore she wasn't moving it, and honestly, I don't think she was. The planchette started to glide across the board, slow and steady, as if whatever was pushing it was just patient. We asked for its name. It spelled out D-O-N-T. At this point, Mark laughed, thinking it was just Sarah or me messing around. Don't what? He asked, mocking the thing like it was some cheap carnival game. The planchette slid again. D-O-N-T-A-N-S-W-E-R. Sarah's grin faded, and I'll be honest, I was starting to feel a little uneasy. Mark, though, was still playing along, not taking any of it seriously. Don't answer what? Come on, give us something real, he teased. Then, the last word came through. M-I-D-N-I-G-H-T. The mood in the room shifted. You ever feel the energy in a room just change in an instant? That was it. I felt like the temperature dropped, or maybe it was just the alcohol wearing off. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Of course, Mark wasn't about to let it go. He tried to ask more questions, but the planchette stopped moving entirely. No more letters, no more cryptic messages. Just stillness. Sarah, always the superstitious one, suggested we stop. Maybe we're bothering something, she said, half joking but also clearly spooked. I was ready to call it quits too, but Mark, being the stubborn idiot he is, kept asking, So, what happens at midnight? Is someone coming? Nothing. We sat there in silence for a while, waiting. But the board didn't give us any more answers. Eventually, we got bored again and switched back to watching a movie. trying to shake off the weirdness. And then midnight came. I remember checking the time on my phone. It was exactly 12:01 when the knock came. It was a single, hard knock. Bam! Like not the kind of knock where someone politely taps on the door, but the kind that makes you jump because it sounds so urgent. We all froze. My first thought was, there's no way. It's just a coincidence. But then Mark looked at me with wide eyes, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing. Sarah whispered, "Do not open it." Mark, being the eternal skeptic, was already standing up. He started towards the front door, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "Seriously, don't. The board said not to answer, remember?" Mark hesitated, but he laughed it off. "Come on, it's probably just some neighbor or something. Maybe someone's car broke down. We can't just ignore it." Another knock, louder this time. Bam, bam. That was when I knew something wasn't right. You know how people knock. There's a rhythm to it. But this knock, it felt off. It wasn't random. It was like the knocking was waiting for us to do something. Like it knew we were inside and was demanding attention. "Don't!" Sarah hissed again, her face pale. I've never seen her so freaked out. Mark pulled away from her and reached for the door. And then... Part 2. The knocking didn't stop. Mark's hand was on the doorknob, and I swear to you, every instinct in my body was screaming, "Don't let him open it." Sarah was dead silent, her eyes locked on the door like it was about to explode. The knocking had stopped for a second, like whoever, or whatever, was on the other side knew we were hesitating, waiting for us to slip up. "Dude, just leave it," I finally said. I wasn't usually the one to get creeped out, but something felt wrong, like gut-level wrong. My stomach was twisted up in knots. And when Sarah, the same girl who laughed through slasher flicks and spent her free time in ghost hunting forums, was backing away, you know it's bad. But Mark, being Mark, gave us this half smirk, like we were overreacting. He was always the brave one, or at least the dumb one. Seriously, what's the worst that could happen? It's probably just some drunk dude or a prank or whatever. I'm not going to let it ruin the night. I didn't respond, and neither did Sarah. We just watched as he unlocked the door and yanked it open. Nothing. The porch was empty. The street outside Mark's house was dead quiet, just the faint hum of a street lamp buzzing in the distance. No footsteps, no people walking by, no rustling in the bushes. Nothing. Mark leaned out, peering around the corner like he expected someone to jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" or something. But there was no one there. Just that thick, unsettling silence that feels like it's pressing in on you. "See?" he said, turning back to us, looking all smug. "Told you. Nothing to worry about. Probably just some kids messing around." He was halfway through his sentence when it happened. Bam! The same exact knock, but this time, it came from the back door. Now let me paint this picture for you. Mark's house isn't some big mansion with a fancy layout. It's a standard 2-story suburban place, but the back door, that leads out to the yard, which is fenced in. Nobody should have been able to get back there without us noticing. There's no gate, and the only way in is through the house itself. The three of us froze again, all eyes now shifting to the back of the house. Mark wasn't smirking anymore. His face went from cocky to pale in about 2 seconds. Sarah stood up, grabbing my arm tightly. "We should leave," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Now." I nodded. I wasn't about to argue. But Mark, being stubborn as ever, didn't move. He was still trying to rationalize it, saying stuff like, "Maybe there's a hole in the fence," or "Maybe it's the wind messing with the door." His voice didn't sound nearly as confident now, though. He was just trying to convince himself. Another knock. Bam, bam! This time it came from the living room window. We all whipped around at the same time, and I swear, I expected to see a face pressed up against the glass. But there was nothing. Just the curtains swaying slightly, as if something had brushed against them. Mark muttered something under his breath, but I wasn't paying attention. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. Sarah was shaking now, her nails digging into my arm. "We need to go. Right now. I don't care what this is. I'm not sticking around to find out." I was about to agree, but Mark did something that I will never understand. He laughed. It was a short, sharp laugh, like he was trying to keep the fear at bay. Come on, guys. It's not real. Someone's messing with us. We can't just run out of here because of a few knocks. He was barely finishing his sentence when the knock came again. This time, it was from the closet. We all turned in unison. The closet was just off the living room, this old, creaky thing that Mark's parents used to store random stuff. Christmas decorations, extra blankets, that kind of thing. But the knock wasn't coming from inside the closet. It came from the door itself, like something was behind it, waiting. It wasn't random anymore. It wasn't like someone was moving around the house trying to scare us. It was like whatever it was inside. I watched as Mark stepped towards the closet, like he was in a trance. Sarah was whispering under her breath now, panicked. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but I'm pretty sure it was some kind of prayer or mantra, something to keep herself from totally losing it. I grabbed Mark's arm just before he reached the closet handle. "Don't," I hissed, yanking him back. "Dude, what if it's something else?" His eyes met mine, and I could tell he didn't have an answer. For the first time that night, he looked genuinely scared. But instead of backing off, he shrugged me off and turned the handle. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a small, dark space lined with shelves. Nothing out of the ordinary. No one inside. But the air coming out of that closet. It was freezing. Freezing. Like someone had cranked the AC and left it running for hours in there. My breath fogged up the moment the door opened wider. Mark stood there, staring into the darkness of the closet. I don't think he knew what he was expecting to find, but after a few long seconds, he finally let out a breath and stepped back. "See?" he said, his voice shaking a little. "Nothing." I didn't believe him. Sarah didn't believe him. And I don't think he even believed himself. We were all still standing there, trying to make sense of what just happened, when the final knock came. It wasn't from the door. It wasn't from the window. It wasn't from the closet. This time, it came from the ceiling, right above us. One single heavy knock. Bam! We all looked up at the same time, and in the dim light of the candles we saw it. The faint outline of something, or someone, moving above us, like a shadow shifting across the ceiling. I swear, in that moment, every bone in my body screamed to run, but we didn't. We couldn't. We were paralyzed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for whatever was up there to make its next move. Mark slowly backed away, his face drained of color. "We need to leave," he finally whispered. His voice was barely audible, but I heard him, and this time I wasn't going to argue. The knocking had stopped, but whatever was in that house, it hadn't left, and it wasn't done with us yet. Part 3. The scratching. I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted. Mark, Sarah, and I scrambled toward the front door without a second thought. My hands were shaking so bad that I fumbled with the lock, and for a few panicked seconds, I thought I'd never get the door open. You know that feeling when something is chasing you in a nightmare? It felt like that, like something was right behind us, waiting. When the door finally swung open, we practically fell out onto the porch. The cold night air hit us hard, but it didn't feel like the kind of cold we felt inside the house. This was normal, October cold. I was trying to catch my breath, heart hammering in my chest, when I realized none of us had said a word. Not since that last knock. We were all too freaked out to speak. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "What the hell was that?" she hissed, her voice shaking. Her eyes were wide, and she kept glancing back at the house like she expected someone, or something, to be standing in the doorway. Mark was still pale, and for once, he didn't have a comeback or a sarcastic remark. He just stood there, staring at the open front door, his hands twitching slightly. I think the reality of it all was finally hitting him. This wasn't a prank, and this wasn't something we could explain away. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. But we need to get out of here, now. Sarah nodded furiously, already pulling out her phone to call an Uber or something, anything to get us away from that house. But before she could hit the call button, Mark spoke up. No, he said, voice trembling. We can't just leave. I turned to him, ready to yell at him for being insane, but he didn't look like he was trying to be brave anymore. He looked scared, the kind of scared that sinks into your bones and makes you freeze up. If we leave, he continued, glancing back at the house, what if it follows us? Those words hung in the air like a fog. It hadn't even crossed my mind. What if this thing wasn't just tied to the house? What if it was tied to us now? What if it didn't matter where we went? Sarah looked horrified. We'll go to my place, she said quickly, her voice wavering. It can't follow all of us, right? I didn't have an answer, but I also didn't want to stick around to find out. I was about to agree, but then we heard it again. A sound. But this time, it wasn't knocking. It was scratching, coming from inside the house. The front door was still wide open, and the sound was unmistakable. A slow, deliberate scratching noise, like nails dragging across wood. The kind of sound that makes your skin crawl. It was coming from the hallway, from the direction of the living room, right where the Ouija board was. Sarah's face drained of colour, and she stepped back, shaking her head. Nope, we're not going back in there. Mark, though, had this look on his face like he was torn between terror and something else. Curiosity, maybe? I don't know what it was, but whatever it was, it made him take a step towards the door. I need to see what it is, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Are you out of your mind? I snapped, grabbing his arm. We're leaving, right now. But he shook me off. What if it's just, I don't know, a raccoon or something? Sarah shot him a look like he'd just lost his damn mind. A raccoon? Did you hear the knocks, Mark? Did you feel the temperature drop? This isn't a raccoon. He didn't argue with her, but he still didn't move. He just kept staring into the open doorway, listening to the scratching. It was louder now, more insistent, like whatever was making the noise was getting frustrated, like it was trying to get our attention. Finally, I snapped. Fine, go check it out if you want, but I'm not going back in there. I grabbed Sarah's hand and started walking down the front steps. You're on your own. I expected him to follow. I thought, at the very least, he'd come to his senses and realize how ridiculous he was being. But he didn't. Instead, he looked back at us and said, I'll just be a minute. And then he walked back inside. I stood there, frozen in place, my mind racing. Every part of me wanted to run, to drag Sarah with me and just get the hell out of there. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave Mark in there alone, no matter how stupid he was being. Sarah looked like she was about to cry. What do we do? She whispered, glancing nervously back at the house. We can't just leave him. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. I didn't have an answer. I just knew we couldn't go back inside, not after what we'd heard, what we'd felt in there. Minutes passed, long, agonizing minutes. The scratching had stopped, and the silence was somehow even worse. I kept expecting to hear Mark call out or something. Anything to let us know he was okay, but there was nothing. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I'm going in, I muttered, pulling my phone out for light. Sarah grabbed my arm. Don't. We'll wait. He'll come out. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Really, really wrong. So I took a deep breath and stepped back inside. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of the candles we'd left burning in the living room. The air was still cold, colder than it should have been for October. And the silence. It was so thick, I could almost hear my own heart pounding. Mark, I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. I moved deeper into the house, past the hallway, towards the living room where we'd been playing with the Ouija board. The candles flickered as I approached, casting weird, shifting shadows on the walls. That's when I saw it. The Ouija board was still on the floor, but the planchette, it was moving, slowly, in small, jerky circles, like something invisible was guiding it. My stomach dropped. "Mark!" I called out again, louder this time. Still nothing. And then, just as I was about to turn around and leave, I saw the letters being spelled out on the board. M-A-R-K. My blood went cold. I stumbled back, my phone slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The board wasn't done, though. The planchette kept moving, slower now, like it was waiting for me to watch. H-E. I took another step back, my legs shaking. I-S. I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on the board. H-E-R-E. The last letter slid into place, and in that instant, I heard it. Mark's voice. But it wasn't coming from the hallway or the back room. It was coming from the ceiling, right above me. Part 4. The voice from above. I couldn't move. I just stood there staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. But that voice, it was unmistakable. It was Mark. "Guys, I'm up here." It didn't make sense. The ceiling above me was flat drywall, no attic, no second floor directly above the living room, just solid wood and plaster. But his voice was there, coming from right above me, muffled like he was trapped in the walls or worse, inside the ceiling itself. "Mark!" I called, barely recognizing my own voice. "Where are you?" No response. Just silence again. That thick, heavy silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I felt a hand grab my arm, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was Sarah, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "That was Mark. He's in the ceiling." "I know," I whispered back, my throat dry. "But how?" Sarah shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. She looked more scared than I'd ever seen her. "We need to get him out. We need to leave. Now." I was about to agree when we heard it again, scratching. But this time, it was coming from above, directly above us. The same deliberate, slow, dragging sound, like something, or someone, was clawing its way through the ceiling. "Help me!" Mark's voice came again, softer now, weaker. "Please, get me out." I looked up again, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. There was no way Mark could be up there. It wasn't physically possible. But the sound of his voice was so clear, so close, like he was just beyond reach. Sarah grabbed my arm tighter, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to go," she repeated, her voice shaking. "We need to get out of here. That's not him." My head was spinning. None of this made any sense. The board, the knocking, the scratching, and now Mark's voice from the ceiling. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that Sarah was right. Whatever was going on wasn't natural. It wasn't something we could explain, and definitely not something we should be messing with. But then Mark's voice came again, this time louder, more desperate. "Don't leave me. Please, I'm stuck. I need you. I'm so cold." That was it. I couldn't leave him. I couldn't just walk out and pretend this wasn't happening. Against every survival instinct, I found myself stepping forward, standing right under the spot where the voice was coming from. "Mark!" I called again, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where are you? How do we get you out?" The scratching stopped. For a long, tense moment, there was nothing but silence. Sarah was behind me, breathing heavily, her eyes darting between me and the ceiling, like she expected something to come crashing through at any second. Then, finally, the voice responded. "Look up." I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I raised my head, dreading what I might see. And that's when I saw it. In the corner of the ceiling, where two walls met, there was a crack, a small, dark crack that definitely hadn't been there before. The more I stared, the more I realized it wasn't just a crack. It was a hole. Tiny at first, but growing. Like the ceiling was splitting open from the inside. Something pushing its way out. "Mark," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Help me," the voice came again, louder now, more insistent. The hole widened slightly, jagged edges tearing apart as if something was crawling through. I took a step back, my stomach twisting. The room felt colder, the air heavy and thick like I was breathing through water. Sarah was tugging at my sleeve now, begging me to leave, but I couldn't take my eyes off the hole. And then I saw it, a hand. At first, I thought it was Mark's hand, pale, reaching through the crack, fingers stretching toward me. But the longer I stared, the more I realized something was off. The skin was too grey, too thin, like it was stretched too tight over the bones. And the nails, they were long and black, curling at the tips like claws. "Get me out," the voice repeated. But this time it wasn't Mark's voice. It was deeper, distorted, like someone was imitating him but getting the tone all wrong. The hand reached out further, tearing at the crack in the ceiling, widening it with each movement. I could hear the sound of the drywall ripping apart, the ceiling groaning under the pressure. "We need to go," Sarah said again, her voice barely a whisper. She was shaking now, pulling harder at my arm, desperate. "Now!" I finally snapped out of it, my brain catching up to what I was seeing. This wasn't Mark. Whatever was coming through that ceiling, whatever was pretending to be him, it wasn't human. It wasn't anything we should be dealing with. Without another word, I grabbed Sarah's hand and we ran. We bolted out of the house, slamming the front door behind us like it would somehow keep whatever that thing was inside. But as soon as we hit the driveway, we stopped cold. Mark's car was still there, but the driver's side door was open and Mark was standing next to it. His back was to us, his head tilted slightly like he was listening to something we couldn't hear. "Mark," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't move. I felt my stomach drop. Something wasn't right. The way he was standing, it was too still, too stiff, like he wasn't himself anymore. "Mark," I called out, louder this time. "We need to leave, man. Come on." Slowly, he turned to face us. But the moment I saw his face, I knew it wasn't Mark. His eyes, they weren't right. They were too dark, too hollow, like someone had taken the life out of them and replaced it with something else. And his mouth, it wasn't smiling, but there was this weird, almost amused expression, like he was in on some joke that we weren't. "Did you hear it?" he asked, his voice low and raspy, nothing like the Mark I knew. "It's coming." I didn't know what he meant, and I didn't want to. Sarah and I took another step back, our instincts screaming at us to run. But Mark, or whatever was standing in front of us, just smiled. And then, before we could react, he turned and walked back into the house. Without looking back, he closed the door behind him, and that's when we heard it. From inside the house, the knocking. Bam. Part 5. The final knock. We just stood there, frozen in the driveway, staring at the house. Every logical part of me was screaming to leave, but I couldn't move. It was like my legs had locked up, like the weight of everything that had just happened was holding me there, keeping me from running. Sarah was shaking beside me, her eyes fixed on the front door. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What the hell do we do?" I didn't have an answer. Mark had gone back inside, or whatever that thing was pretending to be Mark, and now the house felt more alive, like it was waiting for us to make a decision. Every window, every shadow seemed to pulse with this quiet, suffocating presence. And then, the knock came again. B.A.M. from inside the house. Sarah gasped, covering her mouth, and I instinctively took a step back, pulling her with me. It was the same knock we'd heard before, the same heavy, deliberate sound that made my stomach twist into knots. But this time, it was worse. This time, it felt personal. Like the house was taunting us, daring us to come back inside. "We have to go," I said, my voice barely steady. I turned to Sarah, gripping her arm. "We can't—" Bam! Another knock, louder. This time, it came from the front door. We both turned in unison, our eyes locked on the door as it rattled in its frame, like something was trying to break through. And then, it stopped. Silence. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but the faint hum of the street lamp buzzing in the distance, the soft rustling of the wind. I almost convinced myself that maybe it was over, that whatever had been messing with us had given up. But then, we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps moving across the floor inside the house, getting closer to the front door. They stopped, and then, in the same soft, mocking voice that had spoken to us before, we heard it. Mark's voice. Except, it wasn't Mark. I knew it wasn't. It was that thing using his voice, playing with us. "Come inside," the voice called. It was gentle, almost sweet, but there was something wrong in the tone, something that made my skin crawl. "It's safe now." I shook my head, my body instinctively stepping backward. "We're not going back in there," I muttered, more to myself than to Sarah. "No way." But Sarah wasn't listening to me. Her eyes were still locked on the door, her face pale, her expression blank. "Do you think he's still in there?" she whispered. I grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at me. "That's not Mark. Whatever that thing is, it's not him. We need to go, Sarah. We need to leave, now." She blinked, like she was coming out of a trance, and nodded slowly. But just as we were about to turn and run, the voice came again. "Don't leave me," it said, this time quieter, more desperate. It almost sounded real. It almost sounded like the Mark we knew, like our friend who'd been with us through every stupid decision and bad idea. "Please, I don't want to be alone." Sarah stopped, and for a second, I thought she was going to turn around and walk right back into that house. "Don't," I whispered, my voice firm. "Don't listen to it." Her eyes flicked toward the door, and I could see the conflict in her face, the doubt, the fear, the part of her that wanted to believe we could still save him. But deep down, we both knew the truth. Whatever we were hearing wasn't Mark, not anymore. I tugged at her arm, and finally, she turned, her eyes brimming with tears. "Let's go," I said again, my voice shaky. "Let's just get out of here." We made it halfway down the driveway before it happened. The door creaked open behind us. Slowly, deliberately, we heard the soft squeak of the hinges as the front door swung open. We didn't turn around. We didn't have to. We knew what was standing there. But then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't Mark's voice this time. It was mine. "Don't go." It was my voice, perfectly mimicked, calm and gentle, like I was the one calling Sarah back to the house, like I was the one begging her to stay. "Come back inside," it said again, my voice soft, familiar, but dripping with something wrong, something unnatural. "It's not safe out there." I froze, my heart slamming against my chest. I glanced at Sarah, and I could see the terror in her eyes. She'd heard it too. "We're leaving," I whispered, more to myself than to whatever was behind us. "We're leaving, and we're not coming back." We started walking again, faster this time, practically running toward the street. The sound of the door creaking behind us, the soft echo of my own voice calling out. It followed us all the way to the edge of the property. Just as we reached the street, we heard the door slam shut, and then silence. We didn't stop running until we were halfway down the block, the house shrinking behind us, swallowed by the shadows. Neither of us spoke for a long time. I don't think either of us knew what to say. When we finally slowed down, gasping for breath, Sarah looked back at the house, her face pale. "What was that?" she whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know, and I don't want to find out." We didn't go back for Mark. We didn't call the police. We didn't even tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe us? How could we explain what we'd heard, what we'd seen? A few days later, we found out Mark's parents had reported him missing. The house was empty when they came back. No sign of him, no trace of where he'd gone. It was like he'd vanished without a trace. But we knew the truth. He was still there. He was in the house. And every time I walk past that street, every time I see the house out of the corner of my eye, I swear I can still hear it. That knock. Bam! Just waiting for someone else to open the door.